family. Keep that in.
It's always interesting. A couple of things actually. It's always interesting to hear what somebody's going to say about you. But we take for granted, I think, what Forbes says about all of us. Because what's really going on in our mind is, what is he thinking about us, let alone what's he saying about us? So we're always concerned about that. But the other thing is, with all the speakers here, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of them all for tonight, one thing that we really, really do appreciate is that you always give us a nice warm hand on our opening. And you can't beat that. It's interesting when you stand up to give a speech, especially now over the past 2 or 3 weeks, that if you gesticulate, and that's on tape if you want to actually check what I did actually say there a little bit later, not to do this, or this, or this. But one of the stories that has come out, which is widely sort of unreported, so this is an alternative fact that didn't come out, was when Donald actually said, you know, I'm unsure with this job since I got it, whether I'm coming or going. And his wife said, you know, Donald, I think you must be going, because when you're coming, you look like a squirrel that's trying to whistle. See that story? That's going to come back and get you just when you don't want it to. Okay, so we're here tonight from the Immortal Memory's point of view to really have a look into the immortal memory of probably one of the greatest literary artists of our time. Is that true?
Yes.
Okay. Well, let's look at the evidence. Let's put some other runners into that frame. And hopefully what we might do is actually have a look at the immortal memory of Robert Burns from a completely different point of view. Ashmole, Chaucer, Defoe, Dryden, Adam Smith from Kirkcaldy, William Wordsworth are all literary greats in their time. Fantastic literary greats of English literature. Right? Adam Smith, in 1776, constructed The Wealth of Nations, still the handbook of capitalism in the Western world. It still stands the test of time. Now that's got to be great. That's got to be fantastic. Wordsworth, who was one of the great openings of English romance in literature. Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales, the classic, whether you're in higher English or whether you're in A-levels. All fantastic. Every single one of them, and 15 others that I could mention, all worked for Her Majesty's Customs and Revenue. But only Robert Burns is known as the poet and excise man. That is the magnitude of the man that we are here to celebrate tonight. Only Robert Burns was the excise man. William Wordsworth, he was an excise collector in West Lothian, just across the border in England. Adam Smith was a customs controller in Edinburgh. Chaucer was a customs controller in London, and I could list the rest as well. That's who Robert Burns stands head and shoulders above. And tonight what I want to do is have a look at the 7 years that he spent in the service of His Majesty's Excise, so as we can see what he did. And during that time, he constructed some of his greatest works. Tam O'Shanter was written during those 7 years. Right? During the day, he did his duty, and we'll find out a bit more about that later on. He did his accounts at night, and he produced all of the paperwork that he needed to produce as a collector. There's no doubt that during the day, he did his duties, as I say, in his occupation and in his literature, and in his women. He put in a shift. There is no doubt about it. Okay. So what I'd like to do is to have a look at, first and foremost, the service, the excise service that he worked in, and taxation. I'd like to have a look at how he come to join it, and then I'd like to finish off with a day in the life, just so that we can get some appreciation of that. Now in 1644, his when the excise duty was actually introduced into Scotland. And in actual fact, from Burns's point of view, he was the most unlikely gauger, which is the term that he used, as in the person that gauged the amount of tax that was due. He was the most unlikely gauger going. Why was that? Well, he had revolutionary tendencies, we know that from his writing. He was a nationalist, he was at odds with George III's government. He campaigned against power while the poor suffered. That was a lifelong campaign that he had, and he had an immense love of the national drink of Scotland, whisky. So he wasn't really the best person to actually deal with that. However, he went into it. And the service itself, the tax service, as I say, 1644 is when it actually was introduced into Scotland. But excise, the word excise, actually comes from 1643 from a word from Holland. And in the Netherlands, Excise is the taxation system that they had. And that was a corruption of that word, but then called excise in Scotland. And it was designed to raise money for the parliamentary fight against Charles I. It was a temporary tax brought in for 1 year. Oh, then it was brought in for 3 years, and then it was brought in for 10. Now, we've seen this before. This happens time and time again, okay? And in the first year, it was taxed on three things: ales, spirits, and cider. At the end of that first year, they put it on hops, they put it on drugs and homegrown tobacco. And in the third year, they put it on meat, fish, salt, and paper. And in year 10, it was on all of those things, plus starch, glass, linen, leather, hats, and candles. Now you can see from that list that the burden of paying tax fell more to the poor than it did to the rich. So that was at odds at what Burns stood for. The taxman was hated in that system, and it was the most hated tax system going until 1799 when income tax came in. Now the reason that it was in 1647, the revenue offices in London was burnt to the ground, just out of protest. The house in Dumfries was also burnt to the ground in protest in that same year. So you could see he was not a popular character, the revenue man, right? The one thing that went above this more than anything else, and the thing that really got to people, not so much they're paying tax, but it was a thing that still stands to this day, as many of these things I'm going to be talking about tonight do. The excise man had the power of entry and search, and it is the only person in the 4 countries of the United Kingdom that can enter your home without a warrant. They can just come straight in. That's what they had then, and they've still got it. And the thing is, most of these goods that I've mentioned are home-produced goods, and it did not sit well with the citizens of, the classic Englishman's home is his castle, as it were, didn't go down well. They wanted that away from there, but it was not going to happen. So be under no illusions, it was not a happy medium. So in 1644, as I said, every pint of aquavitae or strong waters that was sold had duty paid on them. Excise duty is home goods, customs is anything that's imported. And certainly in whisky, that was the first duty, but then the second duty was brought in, and that was beer, at 4 pence a pint. 4 pence a pint. A pint of beer only costs you 5 pence. Compare that to petrol today. How much tax do we pay on a litre of petrol? You see, it's no different. It's no different. When you compare this, it is really interesting to see it. And certainly the colleagues at the excise offices in Liverpool actually, reckon this, and they know what they're up against. However, let's have a look at where the name comes from, because in the way that it was collected, and this is another thing that taxman actually does, the way that it's collected is not by its own staff. For example, today the retailers collect VAT. Where in the days gone by, it was left to the farmers to actually collect. It was left to the landlords to collect the tax. So the revenue and customs did not even pay people to collect the money for us. They used us to collect them. And that went against Burns's grain as well. Now, interestingly enough, from the farmer's point of view, what they did was they collected from the tenants on their lands revenue that was due on things like candles, linen, anything else that was made. But they didn't do it themselves. The farmers did not do it themselves. They didn't have the time to do it, and so they had to look around to see who they could use to actually fulfill this post. And the only people that were available was the stable folk. Because when they got up and tacked the horses in the morning for the ploughs, they got up and attacked the horses for the wagons, then they cleaned the stables, then their day was free. So those lads used to go around and collect the money. And in 1650, the word taxman, T-A-C-K-S, from the boys that did the tack, that's where the word actually comes from, and that still remains to this day. So there's other things that actually come through. Now, interestingly enough, as we just go a little bit further with this, it gets worse once again for the exciseman, because just over the way in Inveraray Castle, the Duke of Argyll, after Culloden, had all of the tax collectors in his pocket. And what he did, very kindly, was he handed over the residence addresses of all of the sympathisers to the English government, where those sympathisers were either summarily sent to the Tower or executed. So that was the other reason why the taxman was hated. So there's three things going for them. And in 1777, according to the Excise records in the museum at Liverpool, there were 200 illicit stills within a 15-mile radius of Glenlivet. And there were 400 in Edinburgh. And in 1780, revenue papers at HMRC Museum, once again in Liverpool, show 6,000 stills were seized and destroyed in that year alone. 6,000. So it was not a happy place, right? Burns actually quoted when he joined the service that he became a poor, damned, rascally gauger. He was supervised for long hours and all for £50 a year. That was his salary. £50 a year. So how did he join? Well, in England, this was a treasury appointment. If you were going to work for the excise, it was the treasury that did that. But there was also some nepotism there as well. That didn't actually apply in Scotland because it wasn't a treasury appointment, but nepotism certainly did apply. And in actual fact, his two supervisors, Finlater and Stobie, both fathers were actually in the excise. Now, as you can appreciate, with a lot of family connections, the esprit de corps, that was very, very tight within the excise. So much so that when you look at the records, and I've seen these, when you look at the records for the last 3 months' salary of Robert Burns from His Majesty's excise, the signature is not Robert Burns. At that point in time, his supervisor was Adam Stobie that was actually working his patch for him. But it's not even Adam Stobie's signature. So Stobie did the work, but didn't collect the salary. And when you look at the signature on the ledger of the person that signed for the money that Stobie earned while Burns was ill in bed, it reveals one J. Armour. Stobie did the work and passed the money straight over to Jean Armour. That's what the camaraderie was like within that organisation. So, putting it bluntly, gentlemen, they may have been bastards to everybody else, but they really looked after themselves. So that shows what it was like. Now, if the family weren't directly involved, how did you get involved with the excise? Basically, it was merchants, brewers, farmers, traders. If your family was involved in any of that, then you were in. Now, there are 4 levels of hierarchy, and it still exists within the excise today, that you have. You have an officer at the bottom, then you have a supervisor, then you have a collector, then you have a commissioner. And those are your 4 levels. And first and foremost, you need a certificate of suitability. And in 1788, Robert Graham was the person that supplied that. He was a collector. He was also the 12th Earl of Fintry. He was a collector, and he actually answered a letter from Burns, where Burns wrote his intent to join, and he said that he'd been examined by a supervisor, because that's what you needed for this certificate of suitability. Now, it's believed at the time that the supervisor, because the letter is initialed RN, and these still exist in the museum in Liverpool. They're in the archives, but it's still there. The initials are RN. Now, that's believed because it was signed in Allison Square in Edinburgh that it was Robert Nimmo. Now, Robert Nimmo, interestingly enough, we know Burns attended a party there on the 4th of December in 1787, because you can cross-reference that from other areas. And that tea party is where Agnes McElhose, who we now know as Clorinda. So there's lots of things that actually collaborate that evidence that he was there. Secondly, he needed a patron to actually get into the revenue service, into the excise service. And obviously, as Graham was the 12th Earl of Fintry, that suited him particularly well. He met him at Blair Athol on the 3rd of August 1787 on his way north, not long after he passed through here. And also he had two here, James Cunningham, who was the 14th Earl of Glencairn at the time. Interestingly enough, he nearly had a third. He missed out meeting Adam Smith by one day. Adam Smith, you might remember, was the customs controller rather than the excise, and that was in Edinburgh. Now the reason why that's interesting is because Adam Smith had actually already put a letter of recommendation for Burns to join a customs service rather than the excise. Had he have done that, he would have been paid £150 a year. His workload would have been considerably lighter, and he would have had more time to actually produce more great literature, as if he was doing that anyway. Smith had ordered 4 copies of the Kilmarnock edition, and Burns went through to see him. In actual fact, it was Mrs. Dunlop that he met, because Adam Smith was ill and had already left for London, and that's where it came to light in the letter that he wanted him to join the customs. However, in 1786, when he was in Edinburgh trying to shift copies of the 2nd edition to get that up and running, right, that's why he went to Edinburgh. That was his primary objective. But he did, it's believed, have a secondary objective, because in December that year he met Sir John Whitefoot. Now, in that letter that he wrote to him, he referenced wanting to become a gauger. And in there, Whitefoot actually replied back, suggesting that he didn't join the excise, that he actually used the money to buy a farm. Now, Burns didn't go a bundle on this. However, what he did do, because he rated Sir John in terms of as a friend and a confidant and a guidance, that he actually went to buy the farm. So he did that at that particular point in time. Whitefoot also originated from Ballochmyle, which is only 2 miles from Moflin anyway, so it's pretty close. And then we come into the aspect that sort of takes it one stage further than nepotism, because Whitefoot was also the master of the lodge, the St James Masonic Lodge at Tarbolton. Now that further enhanced the poet when the poet joined that lodge, and Burns then became the deputy master in 1784. Now it was also introduced into the Canongate Kilwinning Lodge in Edinburgh, and that's a sign of actually arriving. And during that time he met Glencairn, he met Lord Torfickan, he met Alexander Cunningham, and he also met William Creech, who was the publisher. I'll talk a little bit about him later in a moment. He also met Alexander Naismith. Now Naismith is the person that actually did this picture up here, and it's probably the most common picture that we're likely to see of Burns. Interestingly enough, Naismith was not a portrait painter. Naismith is a landscape artist, and if you go to the portrait gallery in Edinburgh, the majority of the pictures you will see of Naismith are of pictures of Edinburgh, and there are very few portraits, but if that's his only shot of a portrait, it's a pretty damn good one, I think. So in 1787, Burns was saying he had good times, it was the best years of his life. 2nd edition was published. He'd actually enrolled in the Caledonian Hunt in Edinburgh, which meant he sort of arrived. And on the 23rd of April, he was sold the copyright to Creech, William Creech's publisher, of the 2nd edition for £100. £100. It is criminal when we think of it now. It is estimated that Burns cleared £800 from that. £800. And with all due respect, but that's the same as some good clubs raise in one night for a local charity. Yeah? Really gets you thinking. And both, you know, are needy causes. So, Burns wanted to see Scotland, he duly set off. And that's why I say he went to Blair Athol, he met Graham there. He also met Henry Dundas. Now, Henry Dundas was almost like the uncrowned King of Scotland, because he was the MP for Midlothian, he was the Lord Advocate, he was the Treasurer of the Navy, he was the Home Secretary, he was the government election agent. All of these things Donald Trump can only merely dream of aspiring to. However, right, he could have made a position for Burns in the government of the day, but he missed him by one day as well, and his life would have changed as a result of that. However, in 1788, on the 7th of January, Burns wrote to Graham begging for patronage, because something had happened. He wrote to Nimmo's sister, right, and he said in there, I have almost given up on the excise idea. I have been just now to wait on one great person. I have been questioned like a child for my inscription on a sterling window. And in the Golden Line we know that he wrote the injured Stuart race have been replaced by an idiot race. Nothing personal, but I see what's happening. Okay. So such Jacobite statements could not be tolerated by the board. And 5 days later, he wrote to Glencairn to elicit support, and he got the result. 2 weeks later, he wrote to Margaret Chalmers, and during that letter, he actually proposed as well, and got rejected, so we're still at it. I have entered into the Excise, and I will be west for 3 weeks, and then back in Edinburgh for 6 weeks instruction. So that's him in. He's in, and he's up and running. Let's have a quick peek at a day in the life, and if you think you've got a hard life, just copy whack for this, as they would say. First thing he needed to do was to buy the gear. So he needed a gauging stick, that was for dipping the barrels. He needed a sliding rule, that was dipping small casks. He needed a slide rule for calculating the usage. Some of us in this room could probably still remember slide rules, but it pains me to say that. He needed a box and a tape for measuring. He needed a brass plate and a cork float. He needed the Excise guide of the day, which actually stretched to 3 volumes, no more, no less. He also needed the digest of Excise laws, which was a further 5 volumes. All of these were carried on horseback. Now on iPad, iPhone, or any of today's techniques or electronics available. And he also needed a wax and a seal, and we'll find out a bit more about that. Now, in this day, in the 1790s, the excisable trades were likes of brewers, maltsters, tanners, paper makers, brick makers, chandlers, distillers, weavers, etc. And what Burns had to do every morning, there were 103 of these excisable trades in the district that Burns worked in, and there were 3 of them. So there were 3 officers. Right? What he had to do was he had to visit 30 of these every morning with his keys, and he had to unlock the tools so that he knew that they hadn't been making candles or linen or brewing during the course of the night. And then at the end of the day, he had to go back to the same premises, and he had to lock them all up again and then seal them with a wax. And that's how it was done. Every single day. Now at the same time, what he had to do was he had to get from the person how much they were projecting to make that day. That still exists to this day. If you start off in business, the VAT will actually want to know what your projected income is that year. They will then tax you for that, and if you earn less than that, they will give you the refund. So that same technique exists today. Very few laws in the excise have actually changed. Now, as well as doing all of this, so going around, you had to drop in during the day to do some spot checks. And 8 times per year there were sittings, and sittings is where the farmers and the tax boys would actually come in and pay. And these happened in local hostelries, and one of them was the Sterling Arms, just down the road here. Now this was pretty lucrative for people that owned hostelries in terms of this, because Burns's job would be to tally and write up everybody that brought the money in. The collectors basically just picked the money up and went off. And certainly in English days, one person actually knew this happened and waited for them. A certain Mr. D. Turpin, Esquire, because he hit more taxmen than anybody else. Right? And he told these stories in York when he was locked up. However, you can just imagine on a busy day in the Sterling Arms, it must be reminiscent of those opening scenes of Tam O'Shanter. And given that that's when he actually wrote them, it makes you wonder whether that's where he got the idea from. Busy market days, sittings, you know, who knows? However, there's another one that actually comes in here as well, because youngers and tenants, there's another thing that's happened. This is how we get back at the taxman. Everybody thinks about youngers as being the great brewer, we see the little man on the can and everything else. In actual fact, Younger was an excise man. It was his wife that actually ran the brewery. It was her that started it up. And now that happens today as well. There are a lot of guys whose companies are actually in their wives' names. All right, so we see that happening too. However, Youngers and Tanners exported most of their stuff, so it wouldn't actually come under the excise. But the small beer, that's a phrase that still exists in the English language, came about because all of the lower denominations of beer, the small beer, which had small excise duty on it, was sold off. Now this was pretty thin, rancid, vapour stuff. It was awful, okay? And incidentally, it was sold at 2p a pint. And that's where the line in Tam O'Shanter, with Tiffany, we fear no evil. He's talking about the tuppenny ale. He's talking about that horrid stuff. So in 1790, Burns' station consisted of 2 tanners, 11 maltsters, 2 victuallers, 3 wine distillers, 21 spirit dealers, 27 tobacconists, 15 tea dealers, and 22 compounders, which are small victuallers, and he had to get round all of those. And in 1789, his health finally gave way, and he was off for 3 weeks. Now, during that time, he was also, up until 1791, remember, for 2 years while he worked with the Excise, with Gilbert, he was still working the farm. Now, his horse at the same time actually went under, and interestingly enough, we think about, the dashing excise man and going out and raiding ships and so on and so forth. There's only one on the records of His Majesty's excise papers that actually demonstrate that. In 1790, Jenny Geddes, his horse died, so he was trying to actually get a foot walking Dumfries, and in July the 25th, 1790, he got that, so his job became a bit easier, which aided his health. He'd also set his sights on becoming a port officer. Now, a port officer paid £20 a year more, all right? And he never quite got to that. But if we actually look at the incident, which is the Rosamond incident, on the 27th of February in 1792, this is what Robert Burns got up to. So this is the writing from the ledger. Burns and his 2 fellow officers, Officer Penn and Rankin, led a party of 4 horse-mounted dragoons to a schooner, the Rosamond of Plymouth. The vessel being aground about a mile out in the Solway Firth meant that a horse-mounted assault was impossible. They looked for boats along the coast, but the locals, wise to this, hid them from the officers and the dragoons. Eventually, they raided on foot when the tide was low, so they had to wait for the tide to go down before they could do it. 1 party to the fore, 1 party to the aft, and the 3rd on a broadside was led by Officer Burns, and under fire throughout they charged until the crew broke cover and jumped ship on the English side. They poured a 6-pounder cannonade through the side, rendering the ship useless. Now, we've heard about Burns in his day in the life and how he got into it and everything else. But if you ever wanted to rub salt in an open wound, listen to this. The ship and the saleable contents were sold by public auction. Who do you think you are, Bob Watson? By public auction, and made a total of £166, 16 shillings and 6pence. That's for a schooner, okay? It cost £45, 15 shillings and 4pence to repair the vessel, making the net proceeds £121, 1 shilling and 2pence. Now, Burns had to pay the fishermen, the carpenters and the dragoons £17, 10 shillings to keep the vessel safe, as well as the £45, 15 shillings and 4pence to repair the vessel. That all come out of Burns' pocket. He couldn't claim that back on expenses. The reward that he actually got from the excise office for that, £2. £2. And you do wonder, when you're actually looking through these records, with Torquay Scots, that line in Tam O'Shanter, you just wonder where that came from. Is this a personal experience? Ladies really wanted to get to know Burns a lot better, but not that many of them got to know him as an excise officer. They got to know him as a lover. And as I said before, he certainly put a shift in there. But there is no doubt, gentlemen, that a poor, damned, rascally gauger, and a poet, and a professional, was all wrapped up in what has to be the most industrious man that I have ever had the pleasure to research. And Her Majesty's Customs and Revenue, as it is now known, has always taken immense pride in its most illustrious officer. It recognises his position of preeminence among literary greats, as mentioned before, such as Chaucer, Dryden, Wordsworth and Smith. And may I ask you please to be upstanding. Excise man.